advocating for a culture of intentionality in how we design code or how we look at our business and our careers.
Welcome to the LabVIEW experiment. I am your host, Sam Taggart from SAS Workshops. In my 15 years of working with and training developers, I've had the opportunity to conduct a lot of experiments. Over here, we believe in embracing failure as the essential learning experience that it is. And what better way to learn than from other people's mistakes? In this podcast, I talk to industry experts, colleagues, and friends about their failures and how they have turned them into future successes. I'm here today with William Richards, who some of you may know through the GLA Summit and various other things. I think you used to work at NI before you went to IDEXX, right?
Yeah, that was actually my introduction to LabVIEW was orientation at NI, joining the engineering leadership program there. So I was known as the voice of tech support for a while. I helped out with some of the training material. I think that's since been revised one more time, so I may not be there anymore. And then, yes, as many of the ELP engineers do, I wound up at the customer.
Ah,
So I moved back to Maine about 7 years ago and started working at IDEXX Laboratories and then recently spun off on my own.
yeah, we will talk about all of that. My first
Yeah.
question, actually, that just popped into my head. Do you have a crazy tech support story that you can share with us? Are you
Ooh,
allowed to share any of those stories? Because I imagine tech support people get really crazy stories.
yeah. So I think as long as I don't share the particular customer whose name has completely escaped me, so we're safe. Um, Probably the worst call I ever had was a group of engineers in Mississippi who were trying to figure out how to downgrade the firmware on one of their serial devices.
Hmm.
Um,
Was it
because
a
as
serial device?
oh what?
It was an NI device?
Yeah, it was one of the it's a CDAC, I think, or C
Okay.
Rio.
Okay, yeah.
Um,
Like a little module you plug in that then has a serial port on it. Okay.
yeah, yeah. Well, they had written their program around a bug in the firmware
Ah, that then got fixed.
that then got fixed. And as soon as you plugged the device into a new version of the driver, it would update the firmware.
Ah,
Yeah, that was one where it was that entire plant basically ran on this glitch.
that's crazy. It reminds me of the XKCD comic with the spacebar bug. Like, yeah, when I press the spacebar, my processor overheats, and that's how I keep my room warm or something, right? Like,
I had forgotten about that one. That
I
one's
think that
great.
goes to there's some law, and I want to say it's Hiram's law, maybe that like any any user, any feature that anything that the thing does that the user can observe is a feature, and people are depending on it. And if your user base is big enough, you change anything that somebody can observe, suddenly it becomes problematic.
Yeah, yeah. You have to be careful what you give to the user because it's that they will somehow find a way to depend on it. Also, never underestimate the ability of the universe to develop a better idiot.
Yeah.
That
Yeah, if you try to idiot proof everything, yeah, it's interesting.
yeah.
I feel like, yeah, treating people like adults is a good thing. So I've gone through this thing lately with
Mhm.
object-oriented programming where like, the conservative thing is make everything private and don't expose anything. But then when
Yes.
somebody's using your tool, it's really hard for them to then modify it. So for example, if you ship something that ends up in VI-lib, it's nice sometimes as a consumer to be able to like create a child class and override some things and do things slightly differently. And if everything's private, it's really hard to do that.
Yes.
Like give people some room to do things, but also like then yeah, I don't know. I feel like if I go and I do all of that, I know I'm on my own and I'm not expecting support, kind of, but I don't know.
Oh, yeah, that is a whole world of how much support do you give? Um, and that is a problem for lawyers, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I
But
guess when I give stuff away for free on VIPM, like the support contract is not there, so it's like
yeah, it's
that's what I intended it to do. If you do something different with it, good for you.
yeah, the you are free to copy my homework. Just don't come crying to me if you get caught.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's very different than I'm paying you for a tool that I expect to do everything I want it to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Although I feel like the trouble with that is always how do you protect the original code while you're holding on to kind of the open close principle?
Yeah. How do you prevent people from subverting things that you intended?
Yeah. So that's always the kicker for me is it's easy to encapsulate it and make it all private and nice and solid. And then you want to leave it open for extension, but a lot of the times you have to kind of know what's going on under the hood to make a useful extension.
Well, that I think goes to so in general, I'm not a huge festival, but that goes to the Liskov substitution principle in that
Yes.
right, it depends on how it's being used because there's all those implicit assumptions that are made, and I should be able to
Mhm.
use a child class without caring. But the problem is
Yeah.
that I don't necessarily know all the implicit assumptions that are being made of how it's being used without actually diving into the code.
Yeah.
And
Well,
especially if it's like closed source behind the scenes, like you give me a class that I can override and do stuff. Okay, that's cool, but I don't know exactly how you're using it. So how can I create something that is going to meet that Liskov substitution principle and not break everything? Because I might break some underlying assumptions that the developer had, like, oh, they're going to use it this way, and then you try to do something else, and yeah,
that is a very interesting aspect of engineering that I don't think anyone taught us. And a lot of us, I think, go into engineering to solve a problem, and we want to solve the technical problem.
yes, I was about to say that. That is definitely a people problem and communication problem.
Yes. And I think the biggest thing with all of the tech tools that we have to keep in mind that what we're doing as code, we are solving a problem, but we're also communicating.
That is deep. I like that. Yeah, that is the
Yeah.
when I read the refactoring book by Martin Fowler, one of the takeaways was like you're really writing for like two audiences, and one is the compiler and one is the next person to look at the code.
Mm.
And you know, the compiler it's picky in the syntax, but it doesn't care about all the fluff stuff. It doesn't care like in LabVIEW, like it doesn't care if the wires are straight or bent or whatever, right? It cares that they're
Yeah.
wired up correctly, but that's it. The human really cares that things are nice and neat and that they can read them and that
Mhm.
the computer only really cares about the output of the compiler, but the human
Yeah.
cares about all the stuff that it's trying to communicate.
Yes. And the other, you're not only writing for the next person to touch the code thinking it's another person. I've always tried to keep the attitude of William in 6 months
Mhm.
is another person.
Yeah, there is that too.
Yeah. And working empathy. I know this came up at the GLA Summit a couple of years ago. We had Andrea Goulet on,
Hmm.
and that is her big thing. And I think that was very influential on how I have coded for the past couple of years is how do I practice empathy for myself?
Yeah.
And how do I make sure that the other side of this, I recently transitioned, as you mentioned, from being an employee to being a independent freelance contractor. And in both of those situations, how do you leave things in a situation where someone can pick them up?
Yes. Yeah, if you're leaving a company, right?
Hmm.
Assuming that you actually have a little bit of notice that you're leaving the company. Well,
Yeah.
actually, like you don't necessarily always get notice. So maybe that's something that you
No.
should be doing every day, right? Because like you could just get fired tomorrow or laid off tomorrow and
Yes.
what happens? Yeah. Yeah, because it's one thing if you know you're gonna like if you know you're gonna retire, okay, you spend like the last month of your pre-retirement like cleaning everything up. But what if we did
Mhm.
that every day?
Yes. Sometimes you can't. And I know that's a matter of there's only so much you can bite off, so much you can chew. But if you can incrementally, that whole 1% better,
Yep.
if you can leave the code slightly more supportable, slightly more, someone else could pick this up, you're making yourself replaceable.
Yeah.
However, you're also making yourself free.
Yeah. Yeah, because you don't have to support all that. Somebody else can support it. But also
Yeah.
too, yeah, like to your thing, like even if you don't leave the company or leave the role, you're working on a project, you get called off on an emergency, either
Hmm.
somebody else picks it up or that code sits for 6 months and then you come back to it, right?
Hmm.
That's a problem if you're not doing that constant tidying and cleaning. So,
Yeah. So actually, I have a question for you because I know that you do consulting and have for a while. How do you bill that to the customer?
Ooh. See,
Because to me, that's something where I'm doing it for myself
mhm.
initially. Although now that we're talking about it, you're also making it, you are making yourself replaceable and there's value in that.
I was going
You,
to say
you're,
that is part of my initial value proposition too.
yeah.
Like, you can hire somebody cheaper and they may come in
Mhm.
and they may write you something, and it may actually work. And it will probably take longer than it would take me, but okay, they may write something, it may work. But when they leave, what happens? And we all know what happens with crap code that's been sitting around, right? You hand it to somebody new who
Mhm.
comes in, and most of them, the first thing they say is, "Oh, this is crap. We got to throw it away and start over."
Yes. Uh,
Or they say, "Hey, I got to spend several months refactoring this and getting into a state where I can do something with it." And
mhm.
so there's an added cost there. So, and I mean, part of my value proposition is I try to do things in an iterative way, right? And so we build people every iteration. And part of the thing is like, hey, if things don't go well, you stop after an iteration and you can take that code and hand it off to somebody else and go run with that. So it's like
Mm.
insurance policy for them in that like, hey, if we're going too slow or things aren't working out or it's just like not a good fit, take the code and walk away. And it's all there. It's well documented. It runs. I think that's the other thing too is like doing it iteratively and having it run. Because like the worst thing is like I get called in for things where they're like, we hired somebody and they spent 6 months on this project, nothing works. It
Yes.
never worked. And you're like, well, what the heck did they do for 6 months? And then they hand you the code and they always expect you to fix the code. Like they don't want you to start over. They're like, here. And that is one situation where I definitely tend to lean towards the rewrite because refactoring is preserving value. If the thing
Yes.
never worked, does it have any value? Right? Just because they
Funny
spent
thing.
time on it doesn't mean it has value. I can
Yeah.
spend time writing a bunch of novel, like writing, working on a novel, but if the thing doesn't isn't coherent, it doesn't have any good story. Like there's no value there. It's just
Hmm.
it's a sunk cost fallacy at that point.
That is that is a very useful way to look at that. And I feel like way back towards the beginning of the LabVIEW experiment,
Mhm.
I know you prefer the method of working quickly, and then sometimes if you're going the wrong direction, throw it away early.
Yep.
So you never actually get into that situation where you've sunk too much into this.
Yep.
Moving, some people say fail fast, and I think that is a useful protocol
Mhm.
or a useful direction to take things
Yeah.
because you're figuring out, is this going in the right direction? Is this actually adding value or is this a sink? And you can get rid of the slag quickly that way.
To your point though about the cleaning up and make keeping things tidy, those two things are slightly at odds because when you're trying to move fast and I want to just see if this thing works,
Hmm.
it's not worth fully polishing it, right? Because I might throw it
Yeah.
away. But I do want some level of polish so that if I decide to keep it and I decide to go with it, it's in a state where it's good enough that I can then move on to the next thing or spend a few minutes polishing it up and then go. So that's always kind
Yeah.
of a, because I feel like some people they act like they're creating works of art, and I want people to take pride in what they do, and I think it's great that you think it's a work of art, but it needs to be a work of art in progress, right? Because
Ooh.
you polish it, but it's never finished. It's software. The reason we do it in software is because it's malleable, and if you make it a work of art that can never be changed, it's not malleable anymore.
What? Somebody, and I hate that I can never associate quotes with who they belong to, but somebody once said, you never finish a work of art, you just walk away from it.
Ah, that's interesting.
Like a work of art is never finished. You can always change it.
Ah.
A piece of art is finished when you walk away.
When you just say, okay, that's enough. Yeah, because
Yeah.
that is the thing. Like you can always polish code. Like you can always go back and find something. And to our point earlier about like going back to previous code you wrote,
Hmm.
I wrote a blog post something like it's okay to cringe. In that, if it's actually a good thing when you look back at your old code and you cringe because that
Mm.
means that you learned something. If you look back at your old code and you're like, no, this was perfect, Like you can say that was perfect at the time. It was a perfect solution for that particular problem at that particular time. But if you look at it, you're like,
Yeah.
I would do everything exactly the same today. That means you didn't learn anything in those couple years.
Yeah. Either that or you were the one in a million who actually did everything perfectly. But yes,
Yeah, that's not me.
not me either. It is a good human view to say who I am now is hopefully better improved or even just different. That is a sign of growth. If
Yeah,
you
yeah,
didn't grow at
different.
all.
Yeah, yeah. Improved implies like better or worse, and like you know, at that time you were what you were, and like if you were adequate in terms of software, if you were adequate to get the job done and solve the problem that you solved, and it worked, and cool,
Mhm.
that's good, right? Now looking
Yeah.
back on it, though, you might see things in a different light. And you might say, "Oh, well, I did that," and yeah, I got. That's the other thing. Like, did you get lucky? Or were
Mm.
you up to the challenge? Because I do a lot of rock climbing and mountain biking and stuff like that, and all kinds of adventure sports. And one of the worst things you can do is get lucky early on in your mountaineering career. You go climb your first mountain and you get lucky. You do some horrible
Ooh.
things and but you make horrible decisions, but you get the result. And then you start to think, you get that Dunning-Kruger thing where you're like, I know what I'm doing now. And you don't realize that, no, actually, you made a bunch of horrible decisions. Like you went up when the avalanche danger was high and the weather was bad and blah, 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 blah. But you still managed
Mhm.
to summit. And that was a horrible decision. Like you got lucky.
Mm. Yes, because that's also, I think that happens in a lot of areas in our life. And I think we even see that with like lottery winners
Hmm.
who win the lottery and then 2 years later they're poor again. Or a lot of athletes who have very high earning careers, but they're very short lived.
Hmm.
And if they're not wise with what they do with their money, if they got lucky,
Hmm.
then they will come right back into the position they were before.
Yeah, I was reading a good book by Adam Grant called Think Again. I don't know if you've read that,
Mm.
but it's very interesting. But it's about like rethinking our opinions and stuff. And one of the things that I it ties into software very well was they talked about NASA and how they had this high performance culture that was all about like results, right? We launched this thing, we launched that thing, and they didn't evaluate the decision making process. And you can't judge something based on just the outcome. You can't judge, right? Like again, back to the mountaineering example, if you go up in high avalanche danger, but you're successful and you don't get avalanched on, that doesn't mean that was a success, right? Because you took X, you have to judge it based on the knowledge that you had at the time and the decision making at the time. And you judge it based on the decision making, not the outcome. Because you can go up on a low avalanche day and somehow get
Hmm.
avalanched on and die, right? And you
Yep.
still made good decisions. So like it was still what yeah. I guess what I'm trying to get at is like we need to have more retrospectives and look back and look at the decision making process and did we make a
Hmm.
wise decision regardless of the outcome, because we can make a really wise decision to pursue some product and our product is great, everything's good, and then the market falls out, the economy goes to shit, and nobody decides to buy it. Is that a failure?
Yeah.
Not really. We made good decisions, we did the right thing, we built a product that people loved, but the economy fell apart and it just didn't work. Okay.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That that is, I think, maybe advocating for a culture of intentionality in how we design code or how we look at our business and our careers.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. I think in our culture today, and I don't know, maybe you've noticed this shift, but it used to be that companies had intentionality about serving their customers and providing good customer service. And it seems like,
Mhm.
particularly with big tech companies, the intentionality is now let's extract as much value as possible while adding as little value as possible to anybody. I don't know.
Mhm.
Maybe that's me being too cynical.
Uh, Given some of the conversations that I've had about providing value to shareholders,
Yeah.
I don't know if that's too cynical, but also the caution with being cynical is make sure you never get stuck in a position where you're just being cynical
Yeah.
and not able to actually have some sense of agency to do something about it.
Yeah. I think that's it. And I think also part of it is if you're going to be cynical, present an alternative, right? So
Ooh,
like
yeah.
So like my cynicism is people are too companies, big companies in particular, are too focused on short-term shareholder value and not
Hmm.
focused enough on long-term growth and on
Mm.
serving their customer, which is what I think drives long-term growth. So
Yeah.
there's the solution is to change what you focus on, right? So there is,
Yeah.
it's not just like this is bad, but it's like here is an alternative. And if you focus on pleasing your customers and serving them, over time you're going to get more customers. And yeah, okay, maybe you don't make as much per individual customer, and maybe if you squeeze them a little bit more, you can get a little bit more out of them. But if you treat
Hmm.
them well, they're more likely to bring in other people long term, and then everything grows and everybody's happy. And so I don't know.
That at the time that I joined NI,
Mhm.
part of the required reading when we joined was a book called Built to Last.
Is that the what's the guy's name? It's about the companies that. Well, wait, there were two books. He wrote two books. Jim
He
Collins,
did.
is that it? There
That
was
sounds right.
there was Good to Great and Built to Last. I think I read
Yeah.
Good. So Good to Great was like companies that were mediocre, and then all of a sudden, and ended up taking off, and like what made them
Hmm.
take off. And it was a lot of it was about getting the right people and getting the right talent and getting them on the bus. And then Built to Last was the second book. Why don't you?
Hmm.
I didn't read that one. So you, what's the Cliff Notes version?
Uh, the Cliff Notes version of that was that companies that are built to last, one of the things is that they serve the customer.
Hmm.
Like that is one of those tenets. Um, a common theme is that they're also something that is close to required. So
All
you
right.
look at companies like Coca-Cola.
Hmm.
Most of the world, no matter where you go, there's a soft drink and someone will buy that.
Hmm.
And because it is a small luxury or it is borderline infrastructure that you're getting a safe drink in a bottle,
Ah,
yeah, uh, that distribution method, that chain of trust really is what it's selling, is something that's given them an ability to consistently weather whatever else is going on in the economy. And the other part of that was that those companies often had plans that extended well beyond the life of the current CEO, which I joined NI in 2015, which was right as Dr. T was starting his retirement path.
yeah, yeah.
And so there was a lot of planning of succession planning and what becomes of the company after this.
Yeah, wasn't Dr. T known for like his 100-year plan or something? Or is that was that?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like NI leadership is going in a good direction at the moment, but there was a time when I don't think they had a 5 or 10 year plan, other than like
Yeah.
let's make as much money as possible.
Uh,
Which I mean, there's that's me again being cynical. I'm sure there was probably more to it than that. I will give them some credit, but from the outside, that's what it felt like.
I have a suspicion that when Dr. T left, it went from more or less being a family-owned company.
Hmm.
It was transitioning from trying to be a small company to being a large company.
Yep.
And as soon as you make that transition, you expose yourself to the possibility of a buyout.
Yeah.
And if you recall, NI's stock would always cycle.
Ah, yeah.
And so I suspect a lot of that was driven by we don't want to be bought out. How do we get the stock price up as fast as possible?
Ah, well, there you go.
Which is a like if it's successful, it plays into the long plan.
Yeah, yeah.
And if it's not, which in this case, Emerson came along and was the bigger fish in the pond. Well, okay, we had this period where we didn't make decisions that ended up panning out. Going back to what you said earlier, you can't judge it based on the results.
Yeah. Well, also the other thing I've learned too is you can't you can only look at the results. You can't understand what's going on in people's heads and why they did things. So when you start assigning motives, you're like it's easy to assign motives, but you're
Yes.
always kind of on thin ice when you do that. Like, I mean, if somebody does the same thing over and over again and tells you why they're doing it, then okay, maybe you should believe them. But like
Yeah.
if somebody's doing something and you're just observing and you're like observe their actions, you're like, oh well, they must be this, they must be thinking this, or this. It's like, maybe. Like we can make some educated guesses, but like they're just guesses.
Mm,
It's like,
yeah.
your boss gives you a really hard assignment at work. Okay. Is he giving it to you because nobody else is available? Is he giving it to you because he sees it as an opportunity for you to succeed? Is he trying to make you fail so he has an excuse to fire you? Like any of those things could be true. You have no idea.
Yep.
You just gave, like, it is what it is. He gave you a really hard assignment. Okay.
Yep.
And and the other thing about that that's interesting is like human beings, we want to make meaning out of those things, but we
Hmm.
choose. So you can choose to make that mean whatever you want, really, which is you can say, hey, my boss has a lot of faith in me. He thinks I'm going to do really great on this project. It's going to show off. Or you can think the other way. And it's kind of like there's a Henry Ford line, like whatever you think, it's true or something like, like
Yeah.
you can or you think you can't, you're right. Like, and so,
That's the one that I've heard. Whether you think you can or whether you think
yeah,
you can't,
that's the
you're
quote.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like some of that gets into positive thinking bullshit where it's just like, oh, the world is shit. And if you just think positively, somehow everything will be great and wonderful. And it's like, I feel like a lot of that, it's like 50-50, right? It's like, it's the
Mhm.
nature versus nurture thing in a way, right? Like part of it is, are you resilient? Are you going to get back up? Are you going to do this? But part of it is also like, what's knocking you down? Like, like natural disasters and shit, like life happens and bad things happen
Mhm.
and you can't control them. So you have to, right? It can't just be all like, I'll just think positively and everything will be wonderful. Like, no, that doesn't work.
Well, maybe that's the initial impression of failing fast is that it's bad because it involves failure.
Yeah.
And in the same way, looking at positivity and the I can do something about this,
Hmm.
I think is that type of shift of you're not saying I can do whatever.
Yeah.
Um, but you are saying maybe I can robust myself against this particular
Yeah.
interference again.
Yeah, well, I think so. I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and he was talking about like thinking local, is what he called it, I guess, or acting local. And that is the
Yes.
idea that, like, you know, we live in the US, things are kind of crazy right now. Whatever you think of it, like, there's a lot of turmoil. You
Hmm.
can't control that. What you can control is the environment at your work in the sense of, like, if you own your own company, you control the culture there. If you're head of a department, you control the culture in that department. If you work on a team, you control the culture within that team and within
Hmm.
like the GLA Summit, within our communities, within GDevCon. And we can kind of make ourselves little islands in the storm, so to speak. And we can be like,
Hmm.
hey, look, this is whatever's going on out there. This is what we value here. This is the community that we're building here. And this is how we're going to act. And I think that's really powerful.
That is. I've actually been involved in the first robotics competitions this season
Oh, cool.
after a couple of years off. And that is, I think, very much part of their ethos is whatever else is going on in the world, in this competition, we practice gracious professionalism.
Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah.
And whatever else is going on in the world, you can have a wide variety of political or religious or whatever affiliations. Here, this is how we treat other people.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And as long as you're
Yeah.
within that bounds, do whatever you want. But like these are the boundaries, these are the rules, and we're not going to tolerate, I don't know, so some sort of racism or sexism or whatever. Like that's just not part of what we are.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then you can enforce that because it's your community. If somebody's misbehaving, you correct it or you kick them out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's good. So I mentioned the GLA. Why don't you tell us some more about the GLA Summit? We haven't. I feel like we've had an awesome conversation, but we haven't hit any of the points on my notes yet. So I feel like we should get to some of that.
That is sometimes the sign of the best conversation, though.
Yeah, no, I like it. That's why I let it go. But I think we can still have some more awesome conversation around the.
Oh, absolutely. So GLA, actually, you joined GLA before I did,
Oh,
I think, if I recall correctly.
probably. I want to say who started it. Was it Tom McQuillan and
Uh,
Fab maybe?
Tom, Fab, Chris Stryker.
Chris Stryker was definitely involved very early on.
Yeah. There's one other person, and I'm drawing a blank on who the other was. I almost want to say it was Shri.
Who?
Shri.
Sri was there. Yeah, Srinivasan.
Yeah, because surprisingly, he has been like the backbone of the whole thing.
That's cool. Yeah.
For most of the time that I've been there, when something needs to be done,
Yeah.
you often blink and he's done it.
Yeah. Uh,
So,
I do want to make sure we apologize if we left anybody out. That's not intentional.
uh,
I
that
think
is
we hit
very
every.
fair.
I'm sure we probably left people out because I know there were people who drifted in and out over. Like Ollie was there for a while with Ollie and his
Yes.
guitar wrote one of the things. So
Yes.
yes.
And then renovating house is called, and the
Oh, is
guitar's
that
from
what he's been up
storage.
to? Okay.
Yep.
I've
Yep.
not been cool. Yeah, I did notice he kind of took a step back. I didn't really. People kind of come and go, and like there's lots of people that hang around, and like sometimes they're active, and then sometimes they're not. And I figure they're either like busy with life or like as consultants, they probably just got a bunch of work and just like,
Yeah. And that I think is one of the great things about the LabVIEW community is you're bonding with other people who have real lives. And the stuff that we do, especially with LabVIEW, I'm going to back up and say I came to software engineering and LabVIEW from electrical engineering. Um, but my fascination has always been the boundary between the real world and the physical.
okay,
Like robots are cool because I wrote code and it moved a thing.
yeah, yeah.
And on the flip side, I grew up playing music. And how do you capture sound? How do you turn that into a digital thing?
Ah,
As you walk across those lines, you're seeing what you write in code become real, and you're seeing what's real become represented in code. And our community is filled with people who are like that. We're walking along the side between this is real life and this is my job and how I deal with it with tech. So it's awesome that we're able to see people come and go and see life happen around us. And that is where the GLA Summit came from, is it was originally a response to the pandemic. We couldn't have an iConnect, we couldn't have the CLA Summit. And so the original crew, it was, I know Fab was there, I know Tom was there, and Chris, and there is a fourth, and I don't remember who it is. So we can maybe post that in the notes.
well, Steve had his thing, but it was like VI Day or something, and that might have been like the first iteration, right? We did VI Day, and then we looked at that and said, "Oh, that's cool," and then we'll do our another one.
Yeah,
That
actually, I can probably check that
sounds
quickly.
about right.
Let's see. Sarah Zalewski.
Ah, okay, yeah, Sarah. Okay, she's
Yes,
another
she
one
was
that,
part of the original crew.
yeah, doing a lot of stuff and has kind of took it
Yeah.
back lately. Or maybe I
Uh,
just haven't seen her doing things lately. So there's also that too, because there's so much stuff going on. It's hard to keep track of who's doing what.
yeah, which is actually exciting because that is a sign of life in the community, I think.
Yeah, I'm super excited just about the community in general. I feel like, for all the complaining about NI that went on for like the past decade, I feel like now things are moving in the right direction. So I feel like
Hmm.
that's good. Uh,
Yeah.
there's a new optimism in town. So that's good.
Yes.
We needed
Uh,
some.
well, there we go. We've cycled back around to optimism.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Um, and that's actually something that's great to hear about. It's one of the things that we kind of want. And I know we encouraged that last year particularly. Tell us about the cool stuff you're doing with LabVIEW.
Yeah, Steve's always on about that. Like he always wants to see showcases and presentations on that type of stuff, and I think those are always good.
They are. I think they're also a good way for people to get started with presenting.
Hmm.
Um, I know one of the reasons I haven't been on here before is there's this almost innate sense of imposter syndrome. And I picked this up from Chris Cellino. This is everybody who winds up in engineering, it seems like 80% of us have this imposter syndrome that whatever we're working on doesn't make that big of a difference. It's not worth talking about. We don't have something to say. And that's very funny thinking about code as communication and documentation as we're doing all this stuff. And we actually need to share what we're working on and how it works. But when we actually sit down and say, hey, what are you working on? Writing an elevator pitch is like pulling teeth for me. 30 seconds of what am I working on and why does it make a difference is rough, let alone an hour.
Yeah.
But it is also one of the most encouraging things. It is the how do you see the impact that you're having in the world?
Hmm.
And how do you stay motivated in whatever's going on in the world? How do you stay motivated to keep doing the thing that you're doing? It has to. in theory, it could be that it just gets you a paycheck. But usually you actually have some interest in what you're doing. It means something to you. And telling other people about it is a really good way to reflect on it and to say, this is what I've done, this is what I've been thinking about, and here's how it influences how I code.
Yeah, I think a lot of that's just a matter of perspective too.
Totally.
Because like you could just think about it as like, oh, I just churn out code. No, somebody gives me a ticket in Jira and I fill it out and click OK and that's it and that's my job. And like,
Hmm.
okay, yeah, that's one way to describe it, but there are many ways to describe it, and you could put it in different terms.
Hmm.
So I mean,
The
it
one
does
that
help
Chris
you.
gave me was doing cool things with smart people.
Yeah, that alone can be rewarding in its own right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do a lot of cool things in the LabVIEW world. I wonder if part of the imposter syndrome comes from the part that none of us are actually computer programmers by training, which actually I think colors our community in very interesting ways. I feel like we are all more gracious with each other than other
Hmm.
communities because you see the C and C++ communities, and like my impression from the outside is there's a lot of toxicity there, a lot of like Stack Overflow stuff. We're like, how do you not know that? I learned that in the first year of freshman college, blah blah blah. Like you should know that by now. And it's like, okay, yeah, but everybody starts somewhere. So
I am not going to lie, that is very influential in why I went into engineering and not computer science. Was the university that I went to, the attitudes were very different. One was ask nobody for help for anything, figure it out yourself.
uh,
And the other was you're going to be on a team and you're going to have Google. Like, look it up. It's more important that you know how to find the answer than to just generate the answer yourself.
yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah,
will say I'm doing a master's in computer science now. Completely different culture.
yeah. Okay,
Yeah. Much more laid back, much more you're coming into this from mostly at the grad school level. I think people are coming into it from a different walk of life.
okay,
So some of the first classes that I took, it was high school science teachers. It was people who were doing data analyst stuff that suddenly realized they'd hit their limit. As an electrical engineer, I was the closest thing to a computer scientist in some of those classes.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so hearing other people coming into it, trying to figure out how a computer thinks, if your curriculum is oriented towards you're coming out of another successful career and adding another tool to your belt,
mhm.
it results in that much more gracious, yeah, gracious professionalism.
Yeah. I mean, I think gracious in the sense that everybody comes to all these conferences and they're willing to share what they're learning and working on. And
Hmm.
it's and people are more than willing to help each other out,
Yes.
share knowledge. And it's not this closed siloed proprietary thing where it's like, oh, I do my thing and like I can't tell anybody else because then and to be fair, like I'm in the Denver area and there's a whole bunch of consultants out here and we have a very good cordial relationship and things. But from
Hmm.
what I understand, until they started doing the CLA summits, that was not necessarily always the case. I feel like from talking to the older people, the CLA summits are really what kind of opened all that up.
Hmm.
So,
The CLA summits and not the user groups.
yeah, it was much more the CLA summits, like just seeing all the advanced people and just sharing things. Because apparently, like it used to be when you go to NI week and stuff, people were very mum about what they were working on and helping other people
Hmm.
out and talking about some of the technical issues were just like people weren't doing it. So,
Yeah. Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah. Talking about what you're doing, it, figuring out what you can say obviously is a catch because some of the stuff we work on is NDA covered.
yep.
But how do you solve the problems and how do you approach them? Usually you can talk about all of that.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
there's definitely a way to talk about things and share code without sharing NDA secrets.
Hmm. Yeah,
Like,
for sure.
hey, how do I talk to this database? Okay, here's an example. Like, as long as you're
Hmm.
not using proprietary data in the database, like, talking to a database is standard stuff that everybody does. So you can you can do a blog post or a presentation on here's how you talk to a SQL database. Like simple.
Yeah. Although I will say one that is still just there must be a more elegant solution. Config files.
Oh, that is one that like that is definitely something that I think everybody struggles with, and it
I
seems
think
like it should
so.
be easy, and it seems like it should be a solved problem, and it's really not. I mean, like okay, you got the MGI and the JKI read write anythings, and those are great,
Hmm.
but they have their limitations. And then there's also
Yeah.
like not just like okay, I need to read the config in, but like having a nice configuration editor is a
Hmm.
challenge. Like, and people have tried to solve it, but none of them have caught on. And then there's also like, how do I pass that configuration throughout my entire program
Hmm.
without coupling everything? That's the other problem that I think a lot of people have because you tend to pass the
Yes.
configuration around its type defs. And
Yep.
where do you put those type defs? And I've never seen anybody that has a really good solid solution or answer for that. And depending on where you
Mm.
put them, then you end up coupling things that you didn't mean to. And like, yeah.
Yeah, last time that I had to handle a bunch of that, I actually used inheritance and just basically took the in LabVIEW, like a class is just a type def with
Yeah.
methods.
Yeah.
So I took that and I just flattened it to JSON, and that was about as best as I
Well,
could
I've
get.
often thought of doing a lot of that in JSON and just passing around a JSON string, and each thing just knows where in the JSON string to find its stuff.
Yep, exactly. That's
You have a JSON object that's named whatever the name of the thing is, it pulls that out and it knows how to do it, and you can pass that string everywhere, and
hmm.
nobody cares.
Yeah.
No data type coupling. Now, though, there is like an implicit coupling in that your data file has to have those things. But I feel like if you handle the default values well enough, you can kind of get away with that in a lot of projects. It's like, okay, if I can't find it in the string, I have
Mhm.
some sensible default values, and maybe I notify somebody or a log that I use the default values. So if
Yep.
there's a problem, you can go back and trace it back and be like, oh, okay, it couldn't find this, so I used the default value. That was my problem.
Yeah, that is validating to hear that someone else thinks the same way about how to solve that problem.
Yeah. Because I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
like just the coupling issue, like that is one thing in LabVIEW. I feel like coupling is a problem and dependencies. And Alan gave a
Yeah.
really good presentation at GDEFCON and A on how to avoid a lot of that. So somebody else recommended that recently, so I will recommend it again.
Alan Smith.
Yeah. So speaking of
Yeah.
presentations, I liked his presentation because even though it was an advanced topic, he broke it down very well in terms that beginners could understand. It was very actionable. I
Hmm.
feel like at least at GDEFCON and A, and you can speak about GLA Summit. I like presentations that are actionable. There's something that I can walk away and I can do differently or think differently. And I
Yeah.
like things that break it down into simple terms. And if you're going to show something more advanced, I like presentations that show advanced things as built like a combination of simple building blocks. So I really think that is
Yes.
like I often say like the way to become a master is master the basics. And I feel like we feel like I need to understand this very complicated framework and like at the end of the day, like if you look at actor framework, what is
Hmm.
it at the end of the day? And you watch some of Steven Universe, it's a queued message handler, right? And queued message
Yeah.
handlers are a very basic thing. We've built all this inheritance and other stuff on top of it.
Hmm.
But if you can boil it down to it's a queued message handler and you understand it at that level, that makes a lot of things possible. So it's just a
Yeah.
combination of we took a queued message handler, we added inheritance. Oh, we added this, we added that. But at
Hmm.
its core, it's still the queued message handler.
Yeah. It's a queued message handler, and at some point, it just goes down to its do vi,
Yep.
and it does.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So at that level, it's very basic. Now, all the other levels add a lot of complication. And
Yes.
there's some concepts you have to understand. But even those concepts are not all that advanced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when you're coming into it from some other engineering discipline,
Hmm.
it does require a few of the basics of computer science to know, okay, how do I decouple? How do I invert dependencies?
Yes. Those are,
Those are, but also the words are scarier than it actually is.
well, I think that's part of it too. Yeah. The words are scary because you read a computer science book and you don't understand what they're talking about. And it's
Yes.
hard also because all the examples, a lot of the examples are in other languages. And so,
Hmm.
like, my encouragement to people would be learn a little bit of a language, I would recommend either JavaScript or Python because a lot of books tend to be written in JavaScript and Python.
Hmm.
And also learn a little bit of UML. So if you know a little bit of UML,
Ooh,
just like the
yeah,
basics of UML class diagram, like you don't have to be an expert. UML is a deep topic, but just
yeah,
understanding class diagrams and stuff, because then you can read a book that's talking about Java, and if it shows a class diagram, you're like, okay, I understand what that class diagram is. I understand what that means in LabVIEW, and you can draw those
yeah.
connections and parallels.
Yeah, UML has actually been I'm not going to say the bane of my existence, but it has constantly showed up every single project that I've worked on of, oh, if I had a diagram for this, this would be so much easier.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think the UML like the practical approach is there's a book UML Distilled by Martin Feller, and it basically makes the point that like the practical approach is it's just use it for small parts of your program and back of the napkin sketch and stuff. It's perfect.
Mhm.
Like don't some people obsess over like the rules and it's got to follow all the rules, and it's like kind of do what's useful. Like part of
Yeah.
that too, like like you can especially like actor framework projects. Right, you end up with lots of classes. If you go into the Goop toolkit and you click generate me a UML diagram, that's great, except that it's this big and you can't, each class is a tiny dot, like 1 pixel wide on the screen. And you're like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
I
But
hope you
you
like
can draw,
puzzles.
but you can draw your own with some very simple and like include the 3 or 4 things that you actually care about. And then it makes the
Mm.
relationships much clearer as opposed to trying to like document everything.
Yeah, you don't have to document everything. You just need to communicate the point.
Yes, exactly. That's it.
Yeah.
It's the communication part. And if you communicate, that's the other thing, like, right? If everything's important, nothing's important. So if you communicate everything, then nothing stands out. So part of that
Yes.
is like, when you write a README for your project or something, thinking about, well, what are the like if I could only convey 2 or 3 things about this project, what are the 2 or 3 most important things? And make sure I convey those, and
Mm.
then try hard not to drown it out with everything else. And maybe like if you need to talk about something, push it to an appendix or something, and say, here's an appendix about XYZ. And then the
Yeah.
people who need it can find it, but the person just glancing at the document isn't overwhelmed. Um, have you read? There's the 4 quadrants of documentation or something. Have you seen that? There's like
No.
it's like I don't know if it's 4 quadrants, but 4 types of documentation. It's really interesting. If you Google it, maybe we can get Taylor to find a link. But it's like there are how-to guides. There are like glossaries. There's 4 types. There's like how to. There's glossaries. There's Q&A and there's something else like hands-on stuff. And each one
Mhm.
is like slightly different of like what it's trying to convey. So like for example, like a comprehensive glossary is designed towards like someone who knows what they're doing but needs to look up like a tiny little detail versus the
Yeah.
getting started stuff, which is like, hey, what's the easiest way to get up and start with this? Give me a simple example that I can look at
Mhm.
and run. And there's like some layers in between.
Yeah,
And
what do I need to know to get going?
yeah,
What do I open?
yeah.
Where do like yeah,
People fail at that one a lot, actually. I inherit a couple of projects
absolutely.
that don't have a README. And like the first thing I want to do is like, right? Like we learn to like open the project and find the main VI and stuff, and most of us are pretty good at that. But wouldn't it be nice if somebody told you where the main VI was? And wouldn't it be nice if they
Mhm.
said, hey, when you clone this, here's how you run the test. Run the test and make sure it works on your system before you do anything else. And oh, maybe
Mhm.
you need to install this VIPC here, right? So what I like to see is a nice README, but I also like to see like a simple like developer setup script or something or whatever it is that you just
Yeah.
do this first. Double click on this script, run it. It will install the VIPC file. It will, make sure all the PPLs are in the correct places if you need to. It will make sure that this or that's installed.
Mhm. And as much as you can, here are the things that I have assumed.
Yeah. Yeah. Assumptions. Documenting assumptions is huge. Um,
Yes.
yeah. And verifying assumptions too is also huge. You assume things and they're not always true.
Yes. That's
So,
fair.
yeah. I feel like we're drifting all over the place. Do we have any more comments on? We talked about Alan and presentations. Do you want to talk about presentations for the GLA Summit? Because we're looking for
Sure.
presentations right now, right?
Yeah, we are. And honestly, coming back to, do you have something to say? And the lie that we don't, or the idea that we have to present something very esoteric or new, or this isn't a PhD thesis.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is, the beauty of the LabVIEW community is the diversity of backgrounds we come from.
Mhm.
And how a mechanical engineer thinks about a certain concept is going to be different from an electrical engineer. And so we have Tom's LabVIEW Adventure. We have the NI official YouTube accounts. We have constant presentations. You can cover the same thing that someone else has if you're bringing a different perspective to it. And
Which you
there's
are
there's
because
value in
you're
that.
you.
What?
I said you are because you're you.
Yes.
Even if you parrot somebody else, if you're like, I learned all this stuff from so and so, you still have your own unique take on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Synthesizing what you've learned. And of course, obviously, having presenters, great thing for us. But also, I don't want to understate synthesis of information is how we know we've really learned something. So even if it's a basic topic, even if it's just showing off what you've done, figuring out how to tell someone that in 5 minutes, 15 minutes, even 45 minutes, if it's a complicated enough topic, being able to distill it and tell it to someone else is just a really good practice for us,
Yep.
for yourself. And so I definitely basic computer science concepts. I know we as LabVIEW developers don't hang out with like the gang of four ideas, the design patterns. I more times than I have cared to admit, someone will ask me about it because I'm now studying computer science. Like I should know what an observer is, and I don't. It, it's a piece of code that broadcasts. It says, "Hey, this is my current status," even though the observers are actually the other pieces of code. But and I know you actually started briefly. There's a GitLab repository with some of the examples of those gang of four patterns.
Yep.
Um, Breaking those down.
Mhm.
We don't have one spot where someone's gone, "Hey, this is this set of patterns," and helping someone who comes from a different discipline of engineering that isn't familiar with them. How do you quickly get up to speed on understanding what you're seeing? Great idea right there.
Yep. Yeah, I'm reminded of the XKCD comic that like 10,000 new people are born every day or something, and right? And so therefore, like even if everybody on Earth knows something, those
Mhm.
10,000 people don't.
Yeah.
So there's always somebody who doesn't know, particularly like, I don't know if anybody, I've taught some classes for now. I don't know if you've taught any of the classes, but every time I teach Core 1 and Core 2, I learn something new because like
Oh
LabVIEW is such
yeah.
a huge thing and the IDE is constantly getting new features.
Hmm.
And I don't like I can't keep up with the what's new in LabVIEW every year. And so every time I teach it, somebody does something. I'm like, wait, how'd you do that? And they're like, oh,
Yeah. What black magic is this?
I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't know you could do that. So
Yeah. That was it, this is not going to surprise you, but when I was teaching Core 1 and Core 2, first thing that I found fascinating about everyone was what are you actually using this for? And the second was how do you explain this basic concept or what can LabVIEW do? You would constantly learn those things yourself as you were teaching.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
there's definitely a lot of learning. And like again, like you said, you have to understand something at a deeper level to be able to explain it. So you're building your own learning quite a bit. Um,
Hmm.
I will comment on one thing though. You mentioned all the different presentation lengths. Longer presentations are actually easier because
Oh,
it's very
totally true.
easy to ramble. 'Cause- Right? It's very hard to succinctly explain something in 5 or 10 minutes. It's very easy to talk for an
Totally
hour
is.
and go on about something.
Hmm.
So,
Yes. I actually did competitive public speaking in high school,
mhm,
and it was you would have to prepare one 8 to 10 minute presentation and then like four 3 to 5 minute ones.
mhm.
The short ones were brutal.
Yep.
How do you get up and for 3 to 5 minutes express a full and complete idea? It's really hard.
Well, there's a lot of cutting, which is good at
Yeah,
because that gets
it
you
is.
down to the basics and it
Hmm.
really eliminates a lot of the fluff.
Yes. And it is a good exercise. It's a great exercise.
Yeah.
But that is the hard part, is actually delivering the shorter ones. Yes.
Yeah. All right. I want to change direction a little bit.
Sure.
You talked about UI design, particularly, I think you have Tesla, and you were
I do.
complaining about some of the UI designs with the smart screens and stuff. You want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's an interesting conversation.
Oh, yeah. Um, so of course my career has kind of laid over the um the length of Tesla being building more than that one random roadster sports car.
Mhm.
So I got out of college and the latest and greatest thing to roll out of tech news was the Model S. And it was all the luxury and big screens and touch screens everywhere. And then obviously they've moved on to mass market. And in the Model 3, which is what I have, a lot of the controls have been pulled away. How can you make one switch do a bunch of things? Which is a really fascinating engineering exercise. Um, but the interesting thing that I've seen happening in the car world on that note is minimalism and just taking controls and reducing them down to we've got a screen, it's flexible. It's it's a very fun engineering. The engineer in me likes that. And at the same time, when I'm trying to adjust the temperature in the car or when I'm trying to turn my lights on and off, digging through menus isn't a great user experience.
Well, I think that's the thing, right? Do you start
Yeah,
with this is a cool, like, what problem were they solving by doing that? And were they just solving the, oh, this is a cool engineering challenge? Or were they just solving the, like, hey, we don't want to, because the wiring stuff actually, like,
expensive.
it's expensive, right? So were they solving for the expense, or were they solving for that, or were they solving for the user experience? And those all end up with different outcomes. And
They
I mean, I
do.
think part of it is balancing all of that too, right? Because you could design something that's awesome user experience that nobody can afford. Well, okay, that's not really going to work well either.
Yep.
So,
Yeah. So definitely economy of scale, designing, uh, pushing things towards software. It's very easy to build a processor, a screen,
mhm.
and then make all of the differences in software because software is cheap. And so we can get massive economy of scale just by forcing everyone onto the same size screen.
Yeah.
And I, it, it's a very interesting push. Like there's minimalism
Mhm.
as the architectural concept. In order for minimalism to actually be luxurious or good design or anything like that, it actually has to have high investment in what's important.
I was going to say, yeah, because like getting rid of things is good as long as you're getting rid of the things that aren't important. But that requires
Yeah,
having a very good understanding of what's important and what's not.
it is. So it has been a fascinating exercise getting used to like I came out of sports cars into the Model 3.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I liked about my former car was whatever I needed to drive was right at my fingertips.
Ah, you don't have to take your
And
hands off the steering wheel. It's all just right
never had to take your hands off the steering wheel to do anything.
there. Yeah.
And I never had to look anywhere to do anything.
Yeah, you don't have to take your eyes off the road either. Yeah.
Right. With the current interface that is in like the Model 3s, in the new generation, like they took turn signal stalks off,
Yeah.
which really interesting decision, saves money on parts, and still like they put it somewhere accessible. It's one of the wheels on one of the buttons on the wheel, but it's no longer like anything else.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And so you actually run into this very interesting resistance on the other side of you can come up with a very nice solution that's very fancy.
Mhm.
But if it's different enough from the norm, you have to sell someone on that.
Well, an interesting one is like the Dvorak keyboard or whatever, right?
Yes.
Like, presumably it's better because of the way the keys are aligned and stuff. And yet, because QWERTY is the standard, it's not going anywhere anytime soon.
E- Exactly. And yes, it is a legacy. Oh, that's a whole other thing. You know how technologies can springboard.
Yeah.
So, um, in the US, we have basically the original internet.
Hmm.
A lot of countries that have installed the internet in the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of Eastern Europe got this relatively recently. They were able to hop straight to fiber.
Ah.
And so it's really easy and cheap to get really fast internet in certain parts of the world. And here, cable's embedded. We've already run all the infrastructure for that. So why would we replace that infrastructure? Even if it's a big gain, it takes a lot of time and effort and permitting to replace a cable with fiber.
Hmm.
So if you can make that generational leap and you can sell people on the, like, if you can make the generational leap and go from nothing to the latest, it's easy. But if you have an intermediate technology, sometimes that slows you down
Because it's good enough.
because it's good enough. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
But
interesting. And
yeah.
it's entrenched, and the companies that own all of that, like the U.S., the telecommunications stuff is kind of jacked up because we had, I mean, if you study the telecommunication, I mean, this is before my time, but like you had AT&T running everything for a long time, and they were
Mhm.
actually very resistant to modems and the internet and all of that because they didn't want it messing with their phone lines. And like, I
Yeah.
mean, it literally used to be that like you had to buy an AT&T phone to plug it into their phone line,
Yep.
right? And like, yeah, that's
Yeah. So,
and now like the internet access, like if you in the US, like you have like one option or maybe two, and that's it. And
mhm.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
slowly getting better, but yeah.
It is slowly getting better because, progress moves forward. But it's also why we took a long time to get credit card chips.
Yeah, why is that? Because Europe had those for a long time. Is it just inertia not having the infrastructure in, or
It was inertia. It was we have Stripe readers everywhere. So getting people to upgrade to the Stripe reader
yeah.
when it still worked.
Well, even the Stripe reader, right? Like Stripe reader out for a long time, and people still had the old. And I
Yep.
think the Stripe reader was people wanted that because they got their money faster. I think that's for the businesses. I think that was a big investment.
Yeah.
So, like, people could give you a credit card and you don't know what their limit is or if they actually have, right? If they're at their limit or whatever, when you do the
Mhm.
thing with the carbon copy. With the swipe, they can check it. So,
Yeah.
there's probably a lot
Yeah.
of fraud with the swiping or with the carbon copy.
So that was a like generational upgrade.
Yeah. That was a generational upgrade. Yeah, because they didn't have any phone wires or anything or connection connectivity. Yeah.
Yeah. So you went from I have to just write this down and trust that they have a limit and send it to the bank and get a result in a few days to I can have that now.
Yeah.
There's a very clear value to that. This is also another like social mechanism thing. Who you reward or whose problem you're solving is also very critical. So in solving going from typing in the credit card and sending it to the bank to the swipe, you're solving the point of sale problem. Going from the stripe to the card to the chip is a security improvement for the end user.
Yeah. No, I think that is something we don't look critically enough at tech. Like
Yeah.
whose problem is it solving? Who's benefiting, and who's actually losing too? Because
Hmm.
there's often like a losing side to some of these situations too. It's not we act like technology is all this net gain for everybody, but it comes at some expense.
Yeah, it does come at some expense. And there are certainly people who have it, that's philosophy. It really is. There's people who think that technology and humanity generally trend better, and there are people who think that technology trends just however humanity is. It's a bigger hammer.
Yeah. Well, and technology changes over time in the sense that
Hmm.
if you think back, right, like think of Facebook when it first started, right?
Hmm.
And like you also got to think like critically of like who it serves and stuff. It started out as, hey, connect with all your friends and relatives. And that was great. And that brought a lot of value to people. But
Hmm.
now that value equation has kind of changed. And now it's about surveillance and extracting value and selling ads and those things. And it's just like this complete 180. And it's the
It
same.
all went downhill when Farmville went away.
Yeah, yeah. I never got into Farmville. I know more or less what it is, but it's some Facebook game.
It was a Facebook game. It was a idle game, I think, if I recall correctly.
Uh,
Yeah. But once Facebook expanded into we're a single sign-on for other things, and now you're posting game activity, that's definitely when it moved from why have your own blog when we could just host everyone's blog in one place.
yeah,
And when it was used that way, it had a core value proposition for the end user. And there are still definitely useful things about Facebook, like events, marketplace.
yeah,
It's nice to have all of those in one place. Uh, Although at some point you have to deal with the fact that you're basically creating a new internet and a new operating system in a browser.
yeah. There is that.
Like you're now serving a different role once you hit a certain point of covering everything in one platform.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too, when I think about the internet, is we've gotten off track because we're not used to. We don't understand the cost of things because we're used to things being quote free. And I think
Hmm.
this is something like when the internet first started out that was not clear to people.
Yes.
I feel like nowadays it's like the common trope is, oh well, if you're not paying, you're the product. But I don't think people knew that. And also like there's something that feels wrong to me about it in the fact that they hid it for so long. Like, it's like this
Mhm.
open secret, but like nobody wants to come out and say it. And they're all like, "Oh yeah,
Mhm.
this is the way it is, and you should just be okay with it." But if you should be okay with it, why don't you tell people when they sign up for a new Facebook account, "Hey, here's the deal. We'll
Yeah.
connect with your friends and family, but in exchange for that, you're going to give us all your data, and we're going to sell it to like if that was." And they say, "Oh well, we tell you, but it's in the terms of service, and it's this big," and it's like, yeah, like I don't know, anything that
Um,
you have to hide in the terms of service, and you're not willing to say to the customer's face, there's a that to me just feels scummy. Like have it in your
yeah.
terms of service, sure, but tell the customer to their face and be like, make sure they understand this is what you're signing up for. And if people still do that and want to give you their data, like, cool, that's fine. Like, I'm all about.
Yeah. There's something to be said for an economy of trust, basically.
Yeah, I don't know that the internet is an economy. Well, that was actually an interesting. So speaking of the internet and trust, one of the big things, and we were talking about credit cards, was buying stuff over the internet.
Hmm.
That took a lot to get people to do that for the longest time. And now it's like second nature. People have no problem giving their credit card information over the internet. But
Yeah. But yeah, once it gets normalized enough, once you have institutional trust in the processor, basically, then it becomes an acceptable thing. But you're right that I think it's almost we feel like we don't have the power or the option sometimes
yeah,
to choose something else.
yeah. Well, also, so another thing that happened with the credit card thing that I don't know that the average consumer knows. So that brought on a lot of the SSL and the little things in the browsers and all that. But a lot of
Mhm.
what drove that was the PCI compliance stuff behind the scenes. So there's this, what is it, professional, something, processors of credit card information. I don't know. It's
Mhm.
basically this like standard that says that if you want to accept credit cards, you have to meet this standard.
Mm.
Interesting. But the one of
Yeah.
the interesting things about that is that actually, if I understand it correctly, it's an industry group and not a federal regulation. So I think like the feds were like, hey, so people are saying their credit card information, we need to secure that. And the credit card industry kind of preempted them creating regulation, but said, hey, we'll agree to this standard. And I don't know if I'm way off on that. Somebody can correct me. I am not an expert on that. So
Yeah,
that was
but
my
kind of an IEEE standard for credit cards.
yeah.
Yeah.
Which is interesting when we talk about regulations today, and like, there's just reluctance to regulate big tech. And
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like, yeah, it can certainly backfire, and there are certainly regulations that, like, one of the ways that a lot of the regulations backfire is the whole regulatory capture thing of like, hey, Google is advocating for this, and they're going to agree to this because they know that any competitor is not going to be able to afford it because Google can afford all the lawyers and, yeah.
Mhm.
So I don't know. It's
Yeah.
interesting. I
That's
feel,
actually,
yeah. Oh,
we'll leave this to Taylor to keep this in or cut this out.
ha.
But um, one of the non-LabVIEW things that I've been involved with is actually a company called OKI, which is taking machine learning, which is really advanced pattern recognition. That
Actually, I noticed you have Oak AI in the name, but you specifically use machine learning when you were talking about it. And I was like, is that intentional?
It is, and it,
Because I feel like, yeah, machine learning
associations is
is this
hard.
technology that's been around for a while and actually works and does
Yes,
useful things. And
yes.
AI is this term that's applied to all this LLM hype that really does shit. Sorry, I think I'm allowed to say that on the podcast. I mean, it does some things, but like it is way overhyped. So yeah, if I
Yes.
I like the fact that you use the term machine learning because I was like, okay, yeah, they're doing good stuff. They're not like throwing chatbots at it.
Right. Chatbots can be useful for certain
Yep.
things, but yes, they it's a really big hammer. People are looking for nails with a really, really big hammer.
Yes.
Um, and so yeah, Oak exists basically to help people find ways to act on their values. And one of the early trials of how this works is you can take pattern recognition and throw it at terms and conditions that are just too long for you to read.
Yep.
And so rather than taking 45 minutes to read the terms and conditions for D&D or what have you, um, you can condense that to I want a report card.
And check the
So
boxes. Yeah.
yeah, because it's legalese. It's the
Yeah.
same phrases over and over
I was
again.
gonna
What do
say,
they
yeah, it's
mean?
like every contract has like force majeure in it. Well, what the hell does that mean? Right? Like if you're not,
Exactly.
but yeah, once you understand, you're like, okay, yeah, you see the clause about that, and you're just like, okay, and you don't even need to read the clause. You see those words, you're like, I know what that means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one way or the other, like one of the applications of this, they actually Oak has taken that value recognition system
Mhm.
and taken it to Project 2025.
Yeah, Taylor had mentioned this.
Yes, which is it is a very interesting application because it says, okay, here's what this concept is about.
Hmm.
And then because you're able to evaluate a community or a person and say, okay, I care more about one freedom than another, or I care about accountabilities of a certain type. You can create this is what people who think like you think of this. And
Ah,
here is why people might disagree with you if you're interested.
ah.
So you're actually able to flip the card and say, well, I think this way, but why might someone disagree with me?
Hmm.
And in hope, like that gives you a chance to practice better empathy and say, oh, well, this is why I hold these beliefs. This is why someone else would hold theirs. And actually think about, does that make sense of how I view the world? Have I really thought this through? Or am I very convinced that yes, this is the correct path for me?
Yeah, I think that ties into my the book I mentioned earlier, the Think Again book, because people
Yes.
sometimes just get really entrenched. I think
Hmm.
we're seeing that quite a bit right now in our current political climate.
We're seeing that in
And
our current economic climate,
yeah,
frankly.
well, yeah, but when
It's
people
better
get
business.
yeah, but when people get entrenched, then like it doesn't matter what you throw at them. Sometimes it's very hard to get them out of there.
Hmm.
So yeah, one of the things that it actually mentioned was people tend to do like the logic bombing of like, oh, here are all the reasons you're wrong, and you list like 10 reasons. And actually, you mentioned debates, so you might know this. You're actually better off only listing like one or two, because when you
Yeah.
list too many, it waters down the stronger arguments. And also, like if you say these are the 10 reasons why Trump's a terrible person or whatever it is, right? Or why Democrats are horrible, whatever, whichever way you go, all they have to do is find fault with one of those reasons, be like one like, oh well, that one's wrong or that's fake, that's disproven or that disagree, and then every argument you make is like, oh well, that person's biased, so I'm not going to listen to them, and people just get more entrenched, and it happens on both sides. So
Yeah, it
I think
does.
that both
And
sides.
one of the weird ways I've seen this actually is with EVs.
Ah,
Like you can have very long debates over supply chains and life cycle emissions and blah blah blah. Unless you're really interested in that particular thing, it's going to turn into white noise. The fact of the matter is, I haven't been to a gas station in like 2 years,
yeah,
and I've kind of forgotten, like, I don't look at the price of gas.
yeah,
I hop in my car. it's ready to go. And it's warm for me in the winter. Like it is quiet, it's fast, it's easy.
So I had a friend who had a Tesla, and he mentioned that it was incredibly low maintenance. So do you find that to be true?
Uh, I have a few exceptions with mine because the person who owned it before me literally lived on the beach.
Ah, so
So
sand. Oh,
yeah, sand has fallen out of the fenders a few times. So there were a few connections that corroded, but yeah, I've put tires on it, I've rotated them,
yeah.
and I had to replace the brakes because they corroded. That was the kicker.
Okay. Yeah,
But
that's what he said. There's a lot of suspension stuff, but you don't have like oil changes and transmissions and stuff like that. Just doesn't go bad.
nope, and it notifies you when something's wrong.
Although the other question I have too, though, is have you replaced the batteries? Because I hear that can be quite expensive.
So that is a very, very rare occurrence.
Okay.
Yeah. It was actually a bunch of if I recall correctly, it was several of the early Model S's
Okay.
that had like a 3% failure rate.
Ah,
And once you get to the mass market, the Model 3 and the Model Y, it's less than a half of a percent. Like
but
it's
don't they
one in
still have
several
like a
thousand.
lifespan though of like 10 years or 15 years or something? Like you don't, at some point, don't you have to replace the batteries? Even if they don't like fail prematurely?
No,
No? They,
you don't have to necessarily.
okay.
Uh, this is actually technology does some really cool things. I thinking back to like when cell phones first came out or laptops were first becoming popular, your battery lasted 300 cycles.
Mhm.
And you can go through that with a laptop. You can go through that in a year
Yeah.
easily.
Mhm.
But we haven't had to think about that for a while. And the reason is that you only have to charge one cell at a time. So most battery packs now will rotate and say, well, I've got 100 cells. So if I only need to charge 1%, I only need to touch one cell. I'm going to drain it and then I'm going to charge it back up. And the next cycle, I'll move to the next one.
Ah.
So, yes, in theory, eventually your battery density goes down over time, but it never just goes away.
Ah, okay.
So you'll go on and like over time, you'll lose roughly 20% of the battery. And then it kind of bottoms out and plateaus for, practically speaking, longer than you care about.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I just know I was looking at buying a electric car a few years ago, and I was looking at like the Chevy Volts and stuff, and my wife was really worried about like, oh, if you have to replace the batteries, that's expensive. Blah, blah, blah. And I did look into what it costs to replace the batteries, and it was not cheap. But
No.
I did not necessarily get into the details on like how often, how likely that was, or so,
Well, it's typically under warranty for the first 100,000.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
So if your car battery dies at 100,000 miles, you've probably gotten some use out of it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I tend to buy used cars, so I tend to buy cars that have 50 or 100,000 on them already. But
Yeah.
yeah.
But then again, like you hit that point and then you're starting to gamble with the one in 1,000.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah. Anyway, that's way off topic, but
No, that was very good. I think that's a good way to end it because I feel like we've kind of been all over the place and it's gone on for a while. So about that time. Any last minute thoughts?
oh, the only last minute thought is that we actually never explicitly said that was an experiment.
Ah,
Yeah, getting an EV. I was fully expecting that I wouldn't pay anything for, fuel because that was the whole thing.
yeah.
And it is actually the change in attitude towards how I move and when I think about having to drive.
Ah,
That was a complete surprise. So sometimes you do something for one reason. I was coming up on like, had to change a head gasket
yeah.
and suspension needed to be replaced in my old cars. So avoiding that repair was the whole motive. And then it's just my attitude towards, do I think about this? All of a sudden, something that was a recurring cost in my life suddenly became just easy.
Yeah.
And tied to that was actually, of course, I had people asking me, what about, you know, the emissions, the conflict minerals, at some point you stop caring. You're just like, I would drive this as a thing to get me from A to B. I
Yeah.
still like cars. I still would love to go to the racetrack. But as a thing to go from A to B, this isn't about saving the planet, although it may or may not do that.
Yeah.
This is just easy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole saving the planet thing, like, yes, like you want to do things that are under your control that you know, like if there's something
Also
easy that
true.
you can do to, like, by all means do that. But like,
Yeah.
you can't obsess over all of it because we would have no technology or anything if you like, you know, if you're like, I must live with zero emissions, like, go back to a cave. Like, you know, like at some point, like, you know, you have a smartphone, you have a laptop, yeah, like the whole like there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. Like you just have to accept that and be like everything you do has some cost associated with it. A piece of
Yes.
clothes that you buy was probably made in a sweatshop somewhere. I can't, you know, I can try
Yeah.
to buy more local clothes or whatever, or buy more local food, but like ultimately, like, you know, I like avocados. They don't grow them here. Like they're shipped in from
Yeah.
somewhere else. Like, you know,
Well, I'm going to cycle this right back to the beginning because this is kind of where we started it out. Minimalism.
yeah,
It's figuring out like what's the most important thing to me.
yeah,
And then whatever that one thing or whatever those few things are, the important things, I'm going to make those the best that I can.
yeah,
And everything else I'm just going to have to deal with.
yep. I like that. I think that's a good place to leave it. Although I will say, for a podcast where we talk about minimalism, this is probably the longest we've gone. So anyway, I think that's a good joke to leave it at.
Uh,
Hopefully, we hit the important points.
yes, we have invested in the important thing about conversation and connection.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you as well, Sam. It's great talking.
Yeah, we got to make sure she leaves that joke in.
Yeah.
Cool. That's it for today's episode of the LabVIEW Experiment. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments or questions, head over to thelabviewexperiment.com and drop me a note. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at the LV Experiment.